Welcome back. So we're going to deal a bit with some of the ethical and theological consequences of the fact that Joshua is in our Bibles for the rest of our time during this session. And then I'll ask you a bit about what you think about the Joshua stories and how you would handle a question from someone who says, why is Joshua in the Bible? What am I supposed to get out of it? So, in any event, what I'm going to do during this module here, what I'm going to do during this, what I'm going to do during this video is I'm going to give you some resources to think about Joshua. I'm not going to tell you the answer. I'm going to present a bunch of different possibilities and give you some background information that hopefully will help you to craft your own answer. And I think it's important for us to deal with this question because guess what? People are going to ask you this question. They're going to say, isn't it true that God tells us to kill, all the people who live in Canaan? Isn't it true that God is a genocidal monster? Isn't it true that the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition are based in violence? These are real questions that people actually ask, especially people who graduate from seminary. You're going to be the expert in many rooms, and this is going to be like a time that we're called to account for ourselves and for the way we understand our own traditions. So, what do we do? Well, let me give a couple of pieces of background information, and then we'll talk about the specific problems in the text, and then talk about, we'll do kind of like an exercise in moral reasoning. So, the first thing first is that the way that God shows up in the book of Joshua is a very particular depiction of God, or of an ancient God. Not every depiction of God is exactly the same. So, for example, we talked a little bit about how God is imaged differently in the different parts of the book of Genesis. So God shows up differently in the Joseph cycle, right? God is a kind of providence. God is in the background. God is directing things from afar, working good out of what humans want to make evil out of in the book of Joshua, in the story of Joshua, in the story of Joseph, right? So the Joseph cycle in Genesis has a very particular depiction of God where God seems absent but is present in the background. That seems very different to me from, say, the cycle with Jacob, right? And Leah and Rachel and Bilhah and Zilpah. That cycle seems to be focused on God's kind of presence, but God's kind of wrestling presence with Jacob. I can't imagine Joseph wrestling with God. I don't know if you can. But we have different depictions of God. And like I've said before, it's a bit about kind of having different portraits of God. God is so complex. We can't put God into human language and expect that there's going to be one description of God that's going to work for all eternity, right? Every description of God has its shortcomings because it's in human language. It's in human concepts. God's bigger than our brains. God's bigger than human language. So when we use words to describe God, they're going to have problems with them. So that's why it's good to have lots of images of God, because if every image has its weaknesses or weak points or problems that it creates, then we have other images that can kind of fill in. We can hold these different images in tension. And one of the images of God is the divine warrior. And this is an image of ancient gods. So Yahweh seems a lot like this deity here is Asher, who's imaged here. This is a line drawing, like a modern person drew this to show what was etched into stone. It's a bit hard to photograph these ancient carved stone images and to show them in a PowerPoint presentation. So these line drawings are a lot more clear. But if you were at the British Museum, or if you were in Iraq, you could see a lot of these Assyrian Neo-Assyrian wall designs. I'll show you some more of these when we move on in the class because they help to kind of show a bit about the images that were possible at the time of ancient Israel. So this is Asher. He is the god of the Assyrians, the god of the city Asher, which was one of the capitals of the Assyrian peoples. And he's imaged like an Assyrian warrior, and he's got an arrow that has kind of like a flower on the front of it, notice that? But he's shooting this arrow, he's got a bow, a divine bow, and he has a winged sun disk. It's like the sun, and it's really taken from the Egyptians, that winged sun disk with wings image. But it's depicting this god who often fights. Asher is a warrior god. If you see him depicted in ancient Assyrian art, he usually is shooting at enemies, foreigners who are fighting against the Assyrians, and he's trampling on them, or he's shooting them with arrows, or he's leading his army victoriously into battle. Here he is on top of the tree of life. That's the sacred tree that he's on top of, which is an ancient Near Eastern tradition as well. So the divine warrior, a warrior god, right? This is a particular depiction of Yahweh as well. So Yahweh is imaged as a divine warrior, like in Exodus, chapters 14 and 15, where God fights with the Egyptians, right? Moses and the people, the Hebrews don't fight. God fights for them on their behalf. We can see God imaged in Deuteronomy 32, near the end of Deuteronomy, verses 41 and 42. God says, "When I whet my flashing sword and my hand takes hold on judgment, I will take vengeance on my adversaries and repay those who hate me. I will make my arrows drunk with blood. My sword shall devour flesh with the blood of the slain of the captives for the long-haired enemy." So God is depicted here as a warrior, destroying the enemy. Sword, bow in hand, spilling lots of blood. Also marshaling troops. So Yahweh is described as Yahweh of hosts. That doesn't mean laying out the table for a nice meal, hosting a dinner or something. This means Yahweh of the armies. That word Sabaoth is the Hebrew word. Sabaoth means hosts in the sense of like armies, the divine armies. Yahweh's in charge of the divine armies, the chariots of fire. It's an army, right? That God is kind of the general of, the king of. This is common in the ancient Near East. Asher is also called the king of all the gods, but also he's a warrior god, right? He's depicted as a warrior, having like other armies of divine beings that follow him into battle. So this image of the divine warrior has some problems with it. It might also have some strengths. The idea of sacral or holy war, we might just want to throw this out of our Bibles, but it exists. And maybe we can think of a reason that it might exist and why this image of God as a divine warrior might exist. And we might admit some of the shortcomings or problems that are inherent in this metaphor, while at the same time saying that for some people, in some circumstances, in some situations, there is a positive benefit to having some of these images. I don't want to tell you that, but I'm just going to say maybe it's possible. And we're going to explore some of those images and possibilities now. Okay, let's just kind of step back for a moment and just think for ourselves. What do we do with this tradition? So with the conquest, we see problems, right? Hopefully you read the Bible, you see. Let's name these problems, though. What are the actual problems that you see with the book of Joshua? Number one, there's the demonization of the Canaanites. The reason is that to demonize them is that otherwise you'll be like them. So there's a fear of like turning into the Canaanites, and that they're monsters. They're described as monsters. They're monstrous people of monstrous size, and they have to be killed. Their iniquities have somehow like soaked into the ground and made the ground hate them, and they're just depicted as evil people. That should seem a bit strange to us because even the Egyptians are they're kind of bad in some ways to the Hebrews, but also that they're sometimes depicted sympathetically. The Canaanites are depicted as kind of thoroughly evil folks that get kicked out of the land. Now, one thing to say is that there's another group of people who get kicked out of the land and who blame themselves for it, and that's the Israelites themselves. Much of the Deuteronomistic history, which Joshua begins, it's a story that ends with 2 Kings, which ends with them getting kicked out of the land because of their iniquities. So I wonder if there's more of an identification with the Canaanites than there is a complete and utter repulsion from them. Does that make sense? This is the part of us that we reject. And as we all know, we are harsher on ourselves than we are on people that we don't know much of the time. All to say that this demonization of the Canaanites has kind of been tricky and strange to even describe at a historical level. The second thing is this genocidal language, which is ethically problematic. The fact that we should kill all of them, kill all of these people, that should just make us think that, some people have dealt with this by saying, oh, well, there's clearly a different God involved. This is the God of the Old Testament who's bloodthirsty and angry, and there's a God of the New Testament who's very happy, right? As we all know, because I've mentioned this a few times, this is a hobby horse of mine. This is an anti-Semitic trope. Christians who talk about this forget that in the New Testament, Jesus says to pick up a sword. The book of Revelation depicts an angry God who is violent. These images of God and violence span both testaments, and it's not a Jewish problem. This is a problem. This is a human problem. It's very difficult to find a tradition that doesn't in some way have depictions of warrior gods and goddesses, or that gods are involved in conflict. And that's maybe because conflict is a part of human life. How do gods get involved in conflict? This is a problem on many levels. But the use of genocidal language, that we need to get rid of this, but we need to eradicate these people, especially when God in the book of Genesis has said to put aside the bow. That God isn't going to do this anymore. Try to use the bow to get rid of all the bad people in order to make the world a good place. Why does that logic reemerge here and only here, and is never commanded again, or is never repeated again? As in the case of the Exodus, which gets repeated all the time and commanded all the time. If you don't believe me, check out Amos chapter 9, verse 7, where God says that God has done the Exodus, not just to Israel, but to time after time, to all sorts of people around the globe. It blew my mind the first time I read it. Amos chapter 9, verse 7. We'll get to that in the spring. But so the Exodus is an event that God has done for all peoples around the earth at one time or another. What God doesn't do is demand this again and again. But nonetheless, that doesn't get rid of the fact that there's genocidal language in the book of Joshua. Genocidal meaning eradicating a whole people because they're part of a particular group. Then also the images of the violent God, right? This is a problem too. We just need to admit that God is imaged in a violent way here. So that's kind of the structure of the problem, right? Demonization of the Canaanites, genocidal language, a violent God. What do we do with this? So a few things to note. One thing is that Israel is an ancient Near Eastern people. They're part of an ancient Near Eastern culture. This is part of their culture, as I've shown you with the Meshastela. This is the harem, the ban, the rhetoric, the royal rhetoric of that we killed all of them and so on, that propaganda literature, that's something that they're soaked in. They're exposed to this, and it's a part of their own culture. So maybe it has to come out as a part of their culture. But does that really solve our problem? One other thing that people bring up time and again is that I put conquest here with a question mark because was there actually a conquest? Now, we're going to have more time to get into the archaeological evidence for this next week when we talk about Judges. And Professor Yoder walks us through a bit of the archaeological record in ancient Canaan. I'll introduce you to a couple of facts right now that we'll have more time to unpack later. And in the Coogan and Chapman textbook, you'll have more time to deal with this as well. But just for now, trust me, you'll find the information to back this up later. But what I want to focus on now is about the text. The book of Joshua itself tells us not to believe its own rhetoric. The book of Joshua itself tells us not to believe this rhetoric about the conquest. If you read the book of Joshua, chapters 1 through 11 break down into its like a unit, right? This is the story of the sacral conquest, the sacred conquest of the land. Starting with chapters 12 and 13, you get this list of the kings that were captured and executed, and then we start a different really story. It's not even really a story. It's more like just information about the territories starting in chapter 13, and then we have these two final concluding chapters 23 and 24 of Joshua that have Joshua's final speeches and his covenant-making ceremony. If you finish chapter 11, just read with me, chapter 11, verse 16. So Joshua took all that land, the hill country and all the Negev, and all the land of Goshen, and the lowland, and the Arabah, and the hill country of Israel, and its lowland from Mount Halak, which rises towards Seir, as far as Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon below Mount Hermon. He took all their kings, struck them down, put them to death. Joshua made war a long time with all those kings. There was not a town that made peace with the Israelites except the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. All were taken in battle. So we hear all, but then we hear these exceptions as well. But that's the least of it. Verse 20, for it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts so that they would fight against Israel, so that they wouldn't get mercy. So God wanted these people to be exterminated. Look, read that. Exterminated, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Done. Finished. Verse 21, at that time Joshua came and wiped out the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, way in the south, from Debir, from Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, from the hill country of Israel, that's working from the south all the way up to the north, that's the entire span of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their towns. No towns were left. None of the Anakim was left in the land of the Israelites. Some only remained in Gaza and Gath and Ashdod, that's the Philistine lands. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it as an inheritance to Israel, according to their tribal allotments, and the land had rest from war. All. Did you hear how many times all, the word all shows up? In Hebrew, it's kol, right? Kol, like all the land, all the peoples, they were exterminated, utterly exterminated, totally gone. No one's left except for a couple of these little exceptions, right? Just skip chapter 12. Skip one chapter from there. Skip chapter 12 and start with me in chapter 13. Now Joshua was old and advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, "You are old and advanced in years." I always love it when God repeats the narrator, right? "And very much of the land still remains to be possessed." Very much of the land remains to be possessed. This is the land that still remains. All the regions of the Philistines, we heard about that before. All those of the Geshurites from Shihor, which is east of Egypt, northwards to the boundary of Ekron, it's reckoned as Canaanite. There's 5 rulers of the Philistines. So we have here the Philistine towns. And those of the Avim in the south, and all the land of the Canaanites. Hang on a sec. All the land of the Canaanites was left to be conquered? And Mira that belongs to the Sidonians, and Aphek, the boundary of the Amorites, and the land of the Gebalites, and all Lebanon toward the east, that is the north, Baal-Gad below Mount Hermon to Lebohath, all the inhabitants of the hill country from Lebanon to Mizrapoth-Maim, even all the Sidonians. That's all the Canaanites are still there. They're all still... Wait, if they didn't take that, then what did they take? I just want to point out that we're one chapter later. Chapter 11 says they took everything, everyone. Chapter 13 says we got almost nothing. And that's when Joshua died. And turn with me to chapter 23. Chapter 23, one of the final speeches of Joshua. A long time afterward, when the Lord had given rest to Israel, I'm just reading from chapter 23, verse 1. Joshua was old and advanced in years. We heard about this, right? Verse 2, Joshua summoned all Israel, and he said, "I'm now old and advanced in years." Here we have Joshua repeating the narrator. "You have all seen that the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake." Then verse 4, I have allotted to you as an inheritance for your tribes those nations that remain, with the nations that I've already cut off. So there's remaining nations. Verse 5, the Lord your God will push them back before you and drive them out of your sight, and you will possess their land. I thought they already possessed their land, all of it. They exterminated all of them. Instead, Joshua has to tell them there are people who were left behind, and they're going to try to trap you and so on. That's verses 11, 12, 13. Why are there people who are still going to remain and that are trying to trap them? Why is he saying that God's going to drive the people out from before them when, in fact, God has already driven out all of the people? Do you see how this doesn't make a whole lot of sense? Turn with me to the beginning of Judges, because it gets even stranger. The very beginning of the book of Judges, chapter 1. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, "Who shall go up for us against the Canaanites to fight with them?" Why do they have to fight the Canaanites? The Canaanites are all gone, right? Except for the Philistines. But then the Lord said that Judah is going to go up, and then they go up and they fight and so on. And then all of chapter 1 is all about how they all have to go fight. Every tribe has to go fight for their own territory. After the death of Joshua is when this is all said to occur. They go fight against all these territories here. And take a look at chapter 1, verse 17. Judah went with his brother Simeon. These are the tribes, right? The tribe of Judah and Simeon. They defeated the Canaanites who inhabited Zaphath and devoted it to destruction. There's the harem, right? The ban. So the city was called Hormah. Then Judah took Gaza with its territory, Ashkelon and Ekron. Wait, I thought they didn't take the Philistine towns. The Lord was with Judah, but he took possession of the hill country. He couldn't drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron. So they only live in the mountain areas. They don't live in the plains. The plains it's the nice land. That's the land that you want to farm. Instead, they only can occupy the hill country. And this is something we hear of in the rest of Judges. They only inhabit these mountainous areas that no one really wants to live in. Verse 21, the Benjaminites did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived in Jerusalem on the Benjaminites to this day. So David takes Jerusalem, right? So if they killed all the Canaanites, why were there Canaanites still living in Jerusalem when David lived hundreds of years later, right? Seems strange. It's because they didn't kill all the Canaanites. Did they even kill any of the Canaanites? I mean, here they're losing all these battles. Just watch. So they lose to all the ones in the valleys and so on. Verse 27, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, or Taanach and its villages, or Dor and its villages. These are all the big cities in Manasseh's territory. They didn't get rid of these people. Or the inhabitants of Ibleam, the inhabitants of Megiddo, but the Canaanites continued to live in that land. Verse 28, when Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they didn't drive them out. So they didn't ever get rid of these people. When they took over the land, eventually, after a long time, apparently, of living in this hill country, they actually don't kill all the people. And then Ephraim didn't drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. The Canaanites lived among them in Gezer. Ephraim's the biggest tribe. The biggest tribe it's bigger than Judah in terms of its numbers. Just read the rest of Judges, and you'll see that Ephraim basically runs stuff. Then Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron. The Canaanites lived among them. They became subject to forced labor, but so they're not dead. And Asher didn't drive out the inhabitants of Akko, inhabitants of Sidon, Achzib. Asherites lived among the Canaanites. They didn't drive them out. Naphtali didn't drive them out. Verse 34, the Amorites pressed the Danites back into the hill country, the tribe of Dan. Again, they're living in the hills. This is why in chapter 3, we end up seeing that like the Israelites throughout the rest of the book of Judges are basically oppressed. They're oppressed peoples living in hill country, which no one wants to live in. In fact, no one had lived in the hill country that Israel occupies, even from Neolithic times. Cave people didn't live there. There's no sort of the places where Israel ends up emerging in this hill country. We can see that the archaeological evidence for their emergence exists. But they're these little tiny poor villages up in the hills, whereas Canaanites continue to live in the plains for centuries. So we also see in chapter 2 that Joshua dies again, chapter 2, verse 6. And then they bury him, and then Israel's unfaithful, and so on. So all to say, this is Joshua gives us this picture of chapters 1 through 11 of a complete conquest of the land and an eradication of all the people in this genocide. The rest of the book of Joshua is telling us that it didn't happen that way, and then Judges gives us more of the details to say what actually happened was there was a kind of a couple of skirmishes, and then Israel ends up retreating to the hill country that no one had ever lived in before. And then eventually they take over this area, which included the valleys and the Canaanite cities. But that's a very different story and a very different picture. So if we're talking about a conquest, we might want to look a little bit more closely at the actual conquest as described in Joshua. And did you read it carefully? They start in chapter 6 at Jericho, right? Here's a little map here. Here's the green route is the route of the Exodus. They stop here in the plains of Moab. They cross over. They take Jericho, and then, of course, fail to take Ai, and then end up taking Ai after the story of Achan. And then they go do these little excursions in the southern Judahite country. They take Lachish and Hebron and Debir. And then they kind of go up and do this one major attack on Hatzor. We're going to hear about Hatzor, by the way, that city, because there's a major archaeological discovery at Hatzor, which actually does show some conquest. But a lot of these other places, like Megiddo, don't show evidence of conquest. So we do have the story in Joshua of this one major battle at Hatzor and two major battles at Jericho and Ai. The problem is that Ai, the name Ai means ruins. Ai seems to have been a pile of ruins at the time that Israel came into the land during the early Iron Age, late Bronze Age. Jericho is the same way. Archaeological evidence shows us that Jericho and Ai were uninhabited at the time that ancient Israel seems to have become a people, right around the year 1200 BC. There was no one living in either of those places. So that adds another complication to our story, is that the two main stories of destruction seem to have already been destroyed centuries beforehand and had been unoccupied for many hundreds of years before Israel emerges as a people. So they were famous ruins. And then the only other kind of stories of fighting that we hear about, like Shiloh and Shechem and Hatzor, we hear just little excursions. Little excursion into parts of the southern of Judah, and little excursions into the northern kingdom, including Hatzor, just this one major city. That's it. If you read through Joshua, you're like, that's a lot of territory that they have no stories about how they took most of the territory. And then they kind of carve it up in the second half of Joshua, but they say that there's a lot that hasn't been taken. And then in Judges, we see that they only occupy the hill land. Here's an image of Jericho, by the way. Professor Yoder will spend more time, and you'll read about this in Coogan and Chapman as well. There's very clear evidence that Jericho was uninhabited at the time that Israel emerges as a people. What do we do with this information? So this story seems to be kind of set in a nowhere time, in a nowhere place, and it doesn't even try to purport to describe an entire conquest. Then there's the final question of Joshua and this covenant in chapters 23 and 24, which, as I said, seem to kind of be pitched to people who aren't yet a part of the community. So maybe some people have suggested maybe Israel actually grew not by conquest. How was it that Israel takes over these major cities in the plains? Maybe it was by something like conversion. This covenant ceremony that Joshua is calling people to. We don't. A lot of these cities in Canaan actually don't have destruction layers. They don't seem to have ever been destroyed, at least by Israelites. They were taken over somehow, but maybe the people became Israelites. Maybe this explains also why Hebrew is a Canaanite language, and why the Israelite people have completely Canaanite material culture. The clothes they wear, the kinds of bowls they make. There are some differences with Canaanites, but by and large, it's the same world they're living in. We'll get to some material differences later, but all to say, it's not like you've got this radically different type of people living in the hill country and in the lowlands when Israel emerges. They seem to be speaking the same language. Well, how is that? Well, maybe because the Canaanites became the Israelites. It's one way of thinking about this story. All to say too, just to make very clear what this kind of outline the story for you. I've been talking about chapters 1 through 12 as a unit about the stories of invasion and conquest, the sacral entry across the Jordan, the battles in the hill country, the summary of the victories, and these summaries of the conquest in chapters 11 and 12, the kings they killed and all that stuff. And that part starting with chapter 11, verse 16, where it talks about all the kings, we killed everyone, we killed all the people. And then chapters 13 through 21, that's just this story of the division and allotment of the land that apparently hadn't all been taken yet. And then in chapters 22 through 24, we get, especially 23 and 24, we see these speeches of Joshua and that covenantal ceremony. So it's not like there's nothing else in the book of Joshua. There's not a part that we're missing that describes, that answers all these questions for us. We read Joshua and Judges together. We look at the archaeological record and we say, this is really tough. This makes it, what actually happened there? So the biblical evidence is mixed, and the archaeological evidence is mixed too. So on one hand, we know Israel emerges right around the year 1200. That Merneptah Stela tells us something about that. Something happened. We can see archaeological evidence of things happening, especially 250 at least little villages sprouting up in places where no one had ever lived before in the hill country. As I said, Professor Yoder will have more to say about the details of this. But let's start our ethical reasoning exercise here. So I'm going to propose some ideas. How do we deal with this? One way to deal with this whole story would be, number one, to say, maybe it just didn't happen. Like, it didn't happen, so we don't have to worry about it. I agree. I don't actually think this happened historically. I think this stuff exists in here for maybe a different reason. But is that a cop-out? Do I not have to worry about it if I think it didn't happen historically? I mean, it's still in my Bible, right? I didn't tear it out of my Bible. The text is the text, nonetheless. So Joshua says things that are problematic. It looks like royal propaganda. There's some ancient Near Eastern ideology about holy war in there. Why would that be in the Bible? Well, if we accept that it's in the Bible, then why would anyone write something like this? And why would I read it? Now, one thing that people have suggested is that the harem, the ban, it's actually a good thing, they say, because the number one reason people have gone to war in the history of the world is for profiteering, right? To take stuff. Americans have been known to go fight in the Middle East precisely because they want things like oil. In fact, former administrations have been very clear about the fact that they were looking for the oil, which is a synonym for money in our contemporary oil-based economy, or our energy oil-based economy. But this doesn't answer the question. This doesn't help us really that much, in my opinion, because, war profiteering is bad, but that doesn't mean that stories about genocide are okay. Maybe the fact that this story only occurred once makes it okay. that we don't have to worry about the story because God didn't command it again and again, right? Like the Exodus. So we can just focus on the Exodus and just forget this happened. It just happened once, right? But it's like a one-time genocide. Not so bad, right? Actually, I think that's so bad. I don't think that's necessarily a very good answer. One genocide is bad. It's an abomination in the way that I understand ethics, and I hope in the way you understand ethics too. So maybe some people have suggested this tells us a bit about God's sovereignty. Maybe the point of this is to tell us that God's in control. That approach might be helped by a particular way of thinking about these stories about divine warriors and holy violence from a particular perspective. That perspective is from the perspective of brutalized people. So the Hebrews were enslaved in the book of Exodus, enslaved in Egypt. They are set free. If we take the book of Judges at face value, maybe they do end up brutalized and oppressed by foreign people. Remember the story of Gideon. He's like hiding out in the book of Judges, chapter 6. Gideon's hiding there because they're oppressed. Israel seems to be an oppressed people for most of the book of Judges. So maybe they are actually an oppressed people among the Canaanites. And this story of God being a holy warrior is in a way something more like, in the words of Abraham Heschel, something like counter-violence. So for people who've been brutalized with violence, this is Abraham Heschel, a famous Jewish theologian and author, rabbi, who was very active in the civil rights movement in the history of the United States and in the 20th century. So this is someone who really put his own life on the line for some of his beliefs. And he said, this is one of his writings, quote, "This is one of the meanings of the anger of God, the end of indifference with respect to those who have suffered human cruelty. In so stating the matter, the divine exercise of wrath, which may include violence, is finally a word of good news for the oppressed and bad news for the oppressors." End quote. The point there is that God isn't committing violence because God wants to commit violence or God likes it or something, but it's in the service of God's salvific purposes for people who have been brutalized. So God gives chances to Pharaoh, chance after chance after chance, and then finally, God ends up saying, "I need to help my people." And there's a final straw at some point, and God ends up acting, listening to the cries of people who've been oppressed, and then getting involved. So maybe it's the case that these stories of divine violence are primarily a message to people who have been brutalized, and written by people who have been brutalized and marginalized and taken advantage of because of who they were. And that this is in some way an imagining of an alternate dimension or an alternate, it's kind of hope, right? What would it be if God came and helped us? It's a message that God cares for you finally, that God hears your cry, and that God will defend you and stand up and take care of you. Think about kind of a child in a way who has gone through trauma, just wishing that the bad people would go away. People who have been marginalized and brutalized often have what's called revenge fantasies, thinking about how they would like to have someone come and defend them and take care of the bad people and make them go away in a way. This is not a terribly complex thought. It's not sophisticated ethics, but it might be a message of comfort. It might be a message meant for people who have been brutalized, and not meant for people who are in positions of power, who are in positions of dominance. That this might be, in fact, kind of evil if taken up and used to assuage the conscience of people, or give energy to people who want to conquer something. Say, for example, the ways that this has been used, the story of the conquest has been used throughout the history of England and the colonial Americas. The way that naming towns like New Canaan, Connecticut, the way that in Native American peoples were called the Canaanites and were named as Canaanites, that should be kind of eradicated. That there were sermons that were preached about the book of Joshua in the early English colonies in the Americas, that explicitly did this theological work of trying to apply the time of the conquest to the time of the English colonists. I'll post an article that I wrote about this, just to show you if you're interested in it, that recently came out, that I co-wrote with a friend named Ken Brown. But in any event, all to say, this story has been used by dominant communities or by powerful communities in ways to justify their violence. But maybe if we read it a different way, right? From the perspective of a brutalized community, or a community that has been oppressed and marginalized, maybe it might be able to speak a word of hope. Perhaps it's there, and there's another way to think about this story is perhaps it's there to communicate some things about God that are hard to communicate, other than saying God has got your back. Right? God will be there for you. God will fight for you. God is going to protect you and stand up for you. Maybe these things are difficult to communicate, especially in an ancient context, without use of some violent metaphors. Perhaps the claims about God being in charge of the cosmos, that this expresses something true about God, even if it's mixed up with a metaphor that has some very plain shortcomings. Or another potential explanation, perhaps this book of Joshua is there to warn us, to show us happens when faith gets ugly, when faith gets tied up with royal propaganda and efforts to eradicate. And that the complication of putting Joshua next to Judges means that maybe the Bible sometimes gives us things that on their own sound right, but then when you start to see the effects of them or the reality behind them, we start to then ask questions about it. That is, the shortcomings of Joshua become very clear when put in comparison to the Exodus, where Pharaoh looks a lot like Joshua, someone who enslaves local people because of who they are, and tries to eradicate them. That sounds an awful lot like Pharaoh, doesn't it? But then maybe Judges shows us the reality behind the situation, and maybe is there to show us the effects of some of this royal propaganda that continues to be applied to Israel time and again. Maybe it's a revenge fantasy that is knowingly not true. Maybe this is a way to enact some kind of desire for the way things could have been, a utopia in a way, kind of imagining a situation, kind of a release of pent-up anger or something. There are many other potential meanings for this text, I'm sure. Maybe it's a trap to try to get people to think ethically. There are many other ways to approach this. One such way is Robert Allen Warrior, Native American scholar, his article, Native American Perspective, Canaanites, Cowboys, and Indians, which does describe what it's like for a Native American reader of the Bible to think about both the Exodus and the conquest narrative, since in the history of the Americas, Canaanite has been used so often to describe Native Americans or Indians. This article is rich, and there's lots to think about. So what I'm going to ask you in the forum is, and read the precise language of the forum to get what I'm asking there. But in general, I'm going to ask you to think about what do you say to someone who asks you, what am I supposed to get out of the book of Joshua? What does the book of Joshua mean? Especially, what am I supposed to do with this language of violence and genocide that I see there? Let's say you have a few minutes to respond to someone in your congregation who really wants to know what to do with this in terms of their faith. What do you say? You can use any of the resources that you found in the materials in the class and the lectures. Feel free to look for other resources. The one thing that I ask you to do is not defend genocide. Please don't do that. Well, I know this is a heavy topic. It's one that is certainly not fun to talk about, but at the same time, I think it's an important topic for us we're going to see this in the next few weeks. We're not going to shy away from difficult topics simply because they're difficult to talk about. Many times in church, we just want to talk about the happy things, the good things. But talking about things like violence are important because we live in a violent world. The world is a violent place. In many ways, people say that the Bible depicts the world as it is, not as we want it to be necessarily. So the violence that we see in the Bible, it's an honest book. We can see that violence around us. So in a way, what do we do with that? I look forward to your responses and your engagements, and we'll move on to the book of Judges in our next session. See you then.